Flood Mythology and Evolution in Scholarship by David Pearce. This is the final poster from our project. Abstract. Among geography's greatest natural occurrences is the flood. One of the best known stories about floods in the West is that of Noah and the biblical account in Genesis. Like most other flood myths, the flood is sent by a deity to punish man for his behavior. Academics have labeled the biblical account and the many oral and written deluge traditions around the world as myth. They used several criteria for this determination, including the inability to verify its claims. This project examines the trail of deluge or flood myths as they scan the globe and exist in almost every major ancient civilization and every inhabitable continent. Scholarship can be traced for these myths as it evolves over time from the scholarship of Christian missionaries during the Age of Exploration to the secular and scientific scholarship of today, which focuses right now on gender studies and global climate change. Our key words for this is the myth, deluge, scholarship, Genesis, flood, Deucalion, ethnographic, and non-Semitic. So what is a myth? A myth is usually a traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. The key word here is ostensibly, which basically means that it cannot be verified as to fact. It could be true, it may not be true. That is not the judgment, but it is a myth, therefore by definition. Where are flood myths found? Well, flood myths are found on all inhabitable continents, including the major regions of Africa, North America, Mesoamerica, South America, the ancient Near East, Asia, Europe, and Oceania. What age are the flood myths? The flood myths vary in detail, but most occurred during the Neolithic or Bronze Age and usually include a deity destroying civilization as a retribution or punishment for mankind's behavior and for the ultimate purpose of creating a new civilization. Next, we have a map of non-Semitic deluge stories. I recovered this from the work of Bernard Lang in 1985 that was published in Anthropos journal. And in it, he shows the use of corroboration, one of the earliest of scholarship. And so this map depicts the flood myths that exist globally. The shapes and the keys specify the reliability of the myth and whether it includes a reference to a rainbow. If you look at the key there, the upside down U on almost every continent depicts a flood myth with the rainbow motif. And then you've got the squares that are fragmentary evidence that's included. And then you've also got the triangulars that have extensive documentation of deluge traditions. On my poster, I included several of the most famous myths from the different areas, and this one depicts the ancient Near East flood myths, there being two. First one is the story of Noah's Ark from Genesis 6 to 9, which is the most famous of the flood myths. God is convinced that man has become so corrupt that it is necessary to purge the earth and start over. He directs Noah to build an ark to save a remnant of the animals and his own family. The second one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is historians would consider to actually be older. And this is a Mesopotamian flood myth where Utnapishtim is the hero, and the god Ea comes to him and leaks the plan of the gods to flood and destroy the inhabitants of the earth. Unlike in Genesis, where man has become sinful and corrupt, in this particular story, the gods are upset because the mankind has become too noisy, and they can't sleep. They're too disturbed. So after building a boat and surviving the flood, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality by Enlil. Next, we have the Asian myths, and the first one is the Indian flood myth of Manu and Matsya, found in the Shatapatha Brahmana, and it tells the story where Vishnu in fish form warns Manu, who is that's the name for human in Hindi, just like Adam or Adam is the name in Hebrew. And it tells him to store all the grains and animals in one version uh, in a boat to escape the great flood that is coming to destroy mankind. And so Manu and seven sages, and sages are basically wise men who are left upon the earth to help guide the Hindu believers in their dharma, trying to figure out what is their purpose, what is the right living for for them uh, to be able to go into reincarnation and do their best. So these sages survive as Vishnu pulls them to safety in the form of this fish. The Great Flood of China is the next one, and that one is depicted as the first Emperor Yu engineers dams to hold back the water and appoints Gun to steal earth from the supreme divinity to create China out of the chaos of the waters. This is kind of like supernatural dirt, and it absorbs all the water and basically creates land. And here Yu is slaying one of the dragons, bringing the flood. The dragon is always very symbolic in myth, and in this particular case, kind of bringing evil upon man, I guess is a way to put it. Um, and this is a very interesting one. It's of newer scholarship. There's been a lot of scholarship in China about this, and they found a lot of things that I will mention in my literature review and in my paper. European myths. The next one comes from Greece, and it's one that very many people are familiar with as well. It's Deucalion and Pyrrha from the Theogony, and it depicts the Greek god Prometheus telling his son Deucalion to build a chest instead of a boat to escape the great deluge coming to destroy mankind. One of the exceptions to this story is that there was mention of a few people that actually survived the flood in addition to them, who were able to get to the mountains very quickly. And this it's unknown whether this was a later addition or maybe it was the earlier edition. Sometimes it's difficult to tell when you're talking about stories and cultural diffusion. But anyway, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were the only survivors, um, and and floating upon the sea for 9 days and 9 nights. So they weren't there quite as long as the story of Noah. And then what you see them in the picture is you're seeing them throwing rocks over their shoulder. And what happens in the story is that two survivors throw the stones behind them, and these stones, the gods turn to humans. And these are the humans that are meant to repopulate the earth. Next, we talk about the American myths, and there's many of those. The Christian missionaries found many of the stories, and they used them for the corroboration, of course, of the Genesis story. But one that stands out is one from the Aztecs, and the Aztec flood myth depicts Coxcox and his family as the only survivors of the Great Flood. The waters even covered the mountains, just like they did in Genesis. He is told by the gods to carve out a cypress tree and survive the flood. And many boats back then, of course, from indigenous Americans, they used to carve trees out to make the boats. And so this is an example of that with the cypress tree. And he had 15 mute children, according to the story, and who were taught by a dove. A dove represents usually divinity, sent by the Great Spirit to speak. And these were the ancestors of the Aztecs. So his children who were mute were taught to speak by the dove. And so this was an interesting story that I wanted to include. Uh, Now, let's talk about the scholarship. That is the main focus of this project. Um, we go back to the beginning of the 16th century. Early scholarship included non-Semitic flood accounts as corroboration for the historicity of the Genesis account. So the vast number of varied cultures that most likely had no instance of cultural diffusion served as proof of a global flood. And of course, these were touted mostly by Christianity through the missionaries, through the Jesuits that came out after the Age of Exploration, um, and and then through the universities who were dominated by Christians for a long time of our history. And so this corroboration theory, this is one of the main proofs that they had as far as reliability of the Genesis story, and so that was prominent for quite a long time, and up until about the early 20th century. I'm sorry, probably about the 19th century during the time of Charles Darwin. After Charles Darwin, there was a lot of social sciences developed, and one of them geology, of course. And so geology really started looking at the evidence of floods, and so we see that after Charles Darwin, of course. During the early 20th century, however, two new trends of scholarship began to overtake this view, this corroboration view from Christianity. With a presupposition that Darwin's theories were accurate, archaeologists sought to examine the geological evidence and found it inconclusive. There was some evidence, and the evidence, but the evidence did not support global. It supported more local and regional. So they usually attributed that flood and the geological evidence as a result of these local and regional floods. Another development was through psychology, actually, and during the early days of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, one of the fathers of psychology, came up with a theory concerning myth. And what he did is he examined the stories in the earliest 20th century with the presupposition that since God or deities did not exist, it was necessary for primitive cultures to explain the origin of the world through their myth. And these stories offered early civilizations the ability to make sense out of the world as they knew it and thereby reduce the mental stress that accompanies the unknown. This is kind of like cognitive dissonance in psychology. Many cultural anthropologists also during this time and social scientists used the deluge myths to explain the power and spread of ideas through cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion became one of the major trends in the scholarship, saying that basically that people through land bridges would travel from continent to continent, bringing these stories from the ancient civilizations, and thereby spreading them across the globe. And some of the myths had evidence to support this view, but ultimately, just because the exact movement of indigenous peoples was unknown, the myths created the effect for unknown causes. So um, the cultural diffusion does have some reliability in the theory, but it unlike the geology, it doesn't quite hold the evidence, and so that's still under consideration where cultural diffusion may have taken place. And really, as the more knowledge that we gain in this particular scholarship, the development through cultural diffusion advances or um, does not advance by the evidence, of course. All right. Uh, so, since the 1980s, another scholarship development occurs, and the scholarship of flood myths have basically followed the academic trends of the day. Just like many studies, if you look at just about any scholarship, you're going to see trends, and in those trends, it kind of there's certain popular ones that tend to migrate across all the disciplines. So during the 1980s, literary criticism dominated religious study and many of the other studies, and comparisons were made to various genres of historical documents, including sacred myths. So understanding of the flood myths were made by determining its nature as a genre. And in its definition, the word ostensibly that I had spoke previously um, is the key word to understand how it is to be interpreted, for it does not presume the accuracy or the spuriousness of the flood stories just because it includes deities and supernatural events and activities. Ultimately, science can only validate natural occurrences and cannot speak to miracles by its very nature. It's beyond the realm of science. Therefore, the flood myth can only truly be seen as a possibility of explanation. Most scholars at this point in time now agree that regional floods sparked the flood myths, but the claim for a global flood controversy continues as new evidence is discovered that adds or subtracts to its validation. One of the most recent was with Robert Ballard, who is an underwater archaeologist, and he basically discovered the evidence that the Mediterranean had flooded, and to the point to where it created the Black Sea. And this was a very big discovery in geology. So and archaeology. So he's able to establish a larger region with this evidence, and so the regions have gotten bigger instead of just local floods. Now we're talking more like regional floods in many cases. Still not to the point of global. There's still evidence being looked for. People are still studying it, and as evidence is presented, then judgment will be withheld until that time concerning that. But anyway, most scholars do agree that regional floods are basically behind the myths. And examples of archaeologists being wrong, the myths and the myths being correct does find a place, and it does hurt the reliability of archaeology and geology sometimes. Two instances of this in within the last century was the case of Jericho and the case of the city of Troy, which are cities declared as fictitious, basically by archaeologists and historians, until they were discovered by untrained scientists. These were happened upon, and after examining the evidence of the archaeology, and they basically determined that the story that was told in the Iliad and in the Bible in Exodus actually were very accurate as to what was found in these cities. So, with the popularity of global warming theory and gender studies, we move to another level of scholarship. And these two areas of study have infiltrated flood myth scholarship as well as pretty much every type of scholarship and since the 90s, and then really global warming in the 2000s. But the possible reasons for local and regional floods are attributed to global warming in this scholarship. And it hasn't actually been developed, but there's a possibility that the idea of a global flood could even be explained in these terms as well. If and there may be something in the future maybe coming out on that, but it is not the aim of those involved in the scholarship of global warming to validate anything from Genesis in this particular case. Their whole purpose is to validate that floods that occur on the earth, major flooding, regional, that have brought devastation to civilizations and to mankind, basically were caused by the CO2 emissions and then developed with global warming. The other study that is very prominent in our culture today is gender studies, and whole departments are devoted in universities to gender study. So gender study has gone through pretty much every science, every area of scholarship, and has interjected and and looked at the how the gender studies are affected through the scholarship, especially with the flood myths. And what they do is they show the patriarchal nature of early civilizations through the myths, and the role of women is almost always depicted as the helpmate to the hero, more traditional. Women are seen as necessary for the replenishment of the Earth's population. So a woman is always going to be necessary to be one of the survivors of the flood myth, but they are not held in high esteem or equality with the patriarch for the most part. So this type of scholarship does not deal with the veracity of the flood myth, merely the understanding of the civilization that formulates it. So a little bit different slant on the scholarship with that. All right, that concludes my project presentation, and here is a list of references, and I look forward to any inquiries concerning it. Thank you for listening.